Join me at CMC.
Get engaged and get educated.
Join me at CMC.
Everyone is welcome.
Join me at CMC.
Come grow your relationships.
Join us at CMC.
CMC is real,
Authentic conversation.
Engage with curious people.
Plus, we give you access to thought leaders.
Be informed, be inspired.
Through community conversation.
Come here and meet your neighbors.
Be here in the room.
ask questions,
Get answers.
Connecting people and ideas.
Learn about Columbus.
Who will you see at CMC?
Join me at CMC.
You're invited.
Watch us on live stream or in person.
You're invited.
Join the conversation.
You're invited.
Welcome to CMC!
Ready? Welcome. We are going to get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. Founded in 1976 by 13 visionary woman leaders, CMC's mission is to connect people and ideas through community conversation. To carry out our mission, CMC explores public policy issues, current events, and lessons in leadership at forums like this one every Wednesday. From its beginning, CMC has welcomed everyone. My name is Josh Harrison, president of Improving and a member of the CMC Board of Trustees. I and the board welcome you. We're pleased to see you here in this packed room today. Let's begin by meeting some of our new CMC members. First, we have a number of students with us from Otterbein University. I'm going to say each of your names, and please raise your hand and say present so that we can mark you for attendance. Just kidding, but we do want to always recognize our new members. First, we have from Otterbein, Haley Hodge, Matthew Lanning, Jennifer Odery, Elizabeth Arose, Elizabeth Rioche, Dominic Ramona, Jesus Salgado Sanchez, Diana Salmaron, Jared Setliff, Brianna Teese, Jacob Ware, Ashley Woods, and Timmy Rotrain. Let's give these Otterbein students a round of applause. Additionally, we have a few other new members. Anna Hammerstein, Randy Borntrigger with the City of Columbus, Jill Luxenhoff with Kaiser Consulting, Melro Potter and Doug Stevens with Ohio CASA, and Marty Wookali. We welcome all of you to CMC. Let's have one more round of applause. And speaking of membership, if you're not already a CMC member, we invite you to join us. Membership to CMC is open to everyone. It's affordable, and you'll be helping support the kind of civil discourse that American democracy just might need over the next decade. Please visit the CMC website for more details. Please also take a moment to look at the backs of your forum flyers. You'll see the organizations that support the non-for-profit Columbus Metropolitan Club. To join these generous sponsors, please talk with Jane Scott or Lainey Cuthbert before you leave today's forum. Before we begin, we'd like to thank today's forum partners, WOSU Public Media, the League of Women Voters of Metropolitan Columbus. We would also like to thank Grange Insurance Audubon Center for supporting today's forum and providing this venue for us today. WOSU Public Media is also CMC's partner for the entire Democracy in Crisis series. And last but not least, thank you to the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation and the Columbus Dispatch for presenting today's live stream. Let's thank all of those supporting us today. We started the Democracy in Crisis series with WOSU last summer by looking at America's long history of polarization. We continue it today by looking into the future to see what the next 10 years might hold for democracy. We hope the news is good. Please welcome today's speakers. Kyle Kondik, visiting us from Washington, D.C., author and managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball, Catherine Turcer, the executive director of Common Cause, Ohio, Dr. Herb Asher, professor emeritus with the Department of Political Science at The Ohio State University, and our host, who happens to be celebrating a birthday today, Karen Kasler, with the bureau chief with the Statehouse News Bureau. Happy birthday, Karen, and welcome to you all. You can learn more today. You can learn more about today's speakers in your forum flyers. Before we begin, please welcome Kyle Kondik, who will be taking the microphone for us, and Karen Kasler.
So just as a way of introducing this topic, a common question that I get, I'm sure other panelists also get, is sort of, what do you feel optimistic about in American politics? And often when I get asked that question, it's kind of like, well, I frankly think there is a lot to be pessimistic about if we're being realistic about it. However, I personally was sort of heartened by some of the results we saw last November, just in the sense that there is a lot of scholarship in American politics that suggests that candidates who have extreme positions or sort of ideologically way out of the mainstream, or who again espouse kind of out of the mainstream opinions, and I think specifically sort of how the former president acted on January 6, 2021, and how some of the candidates that he supported talked about the 2020 election very much backward looking, making allegations of fraud that really were not backed up. One of the key questions of the midterm was, would those candidates actually be punished for that? Would they be punished for that sort of extremism in a way that maybe past candidates and under different circumstances have been punished? And the answer in many instances was yes. And we saw that particularly in some of the core presidential swing states, a group that really doesn't include Ohio anymore, even though I wrote a book called The Bellwether several years ago. It became obsolete pretty quickly as Ohio sort of moved more toward the right. But, you had a lot of candidates, particularly for important positions involved in the election process, be it a Secretary of State or the Attorney General level, that did end up losing in the last election. And, the sort of broad kind of sweep of, recent electoral history has sort of been more toward lack of ticket splitting, voters kind of keeping on their partisan jerseys and voting, all D or all R, et cetera. But I do think that voters made some sophisticated choices, and they actually, I'd say, in a lot of respects, kind of punished bad behavior in the past election, which again I think is heartening. And also, you could say that that there were a lot of Republican candidates who maybe didn't focus as much on that stuff, and some of those candidates ended up doing quite well themselves. So that, again, we could focus on a lot of negative things in American politics, and again, I don't want to minimize those sorts of things, but this was, I think, something positive that we could point to from the last midterm. So with that, kick it to Karen.
It's always great to hear from you. Thanks.
Good to hear
I think
from you
I
too.
moderated that one on the Bellwether.
That's right.
So, yeah.
That's right.
So-
The history is it's all still accurate. It's just,
Yeah.
we're trying to project forward today. The projecting forward on that.
Yeah. Right.
Didn't go so great.
Well, I just want to say thanks for the birthday wishes. This is actually my second birthday that I've spent at the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I like this place so much. In 2017, I was here for my birthday when it fell on a Wednesday. And as you heard, I'm pinch hitting for Mike Thompson today. So I worked with him on developing questions. If you like what you hear, that's me. If you don't like what you hear, you call Mike, okay? All right, so after that introduction there from Kyle, and I wanted to go over a couple of real quick things when we start talking about 10 years from now. Let's look back to 10 years ago and what was happening, and you can kind of get a sense of how things really changed. 10 years ago, 2013, some of the biggest stories were the Obamacare rollout and how there were a lot of snags with that. 4 months after Sandy Hook and the shootings there, the U.S. Senate blocked gun control legislation. Republicans in Congress, led by Ted Cruz, shut down government for 16 days. There was immigration reform that passed the House, but it died in the Senate. The Supreme Court struck down major provisions of the Voting Rights Act and the Defense of Marriage Act. And that last one was especially significant because it laid the groundwork for the ruling on same-sex marriage, legalizing it. The 2016 race in 2013 started to take shape as Hillary Clinton left the Secretary of State's office and started her unofficial campaign. Chris Christie after winning a landslide election in New Jersey, was considered the Republican frontrunner for 2016 and 2013. And country singer Trace Adkins won the 2013 edition of Celebrity Apprentice, which was then hosted by Donald Trump. So keeping in mind how much things can change over a decade, and we're projecting forward, as Kyle is saying, I want to open with a question to all of you. Will anything bring everybody together and have the moderates kind of in both parties move closer together, or will it just get worse when it comes to partisanship and the strife that results from that? And I'm going to start with her, Dr. Asher.
Your first question, will anything happen to bring everybody together? No. And what would it take? Well, the history you cited was very appropriate. And what we really have now are so many forces at work out there that are pushing us apart. And first, let's talk about the quality of our citizenry and their appreciation of civics education, democracy, the norms, the institutions of the country. That's very shallow. A lot of the times when politicians like the President Biden would say, this is an existential threat, and I thought most Americans didn't know what existential meant, and they didn't recognize what the threat was. So we have a challenge there. We also have a system that now, in terms of the electoral system, rewards the wrong things. I think Kyle's correct to say we dodged a bullet. He didn't quite put it that way in the 2022 elections, but we came this close to actually having a terrible outcome. And yes, we had some people who were who did split their tickets in Georgia and Pennsylvania, some other places. But what we really have right now are elections that are so influenced, not just simply by dark money on both sides of the political spectrum, actually, although I find the dark money on the right to be more threatening because I see that as more anti-democratic in the thrust of its arguments. But we also have here, obviously, a media environment that every year gets more and more complicated, complex, or whatever. You know, I see some of my age contemporaries here who oftentimes long for the days when Walter Cronkite could say, that's the way it is, and you could actually believe him. But there's so many things out there that really push us apart. And certainly if we start looking at I'll say the ideological media, that's very worrisome. And keep in mind, many of our citizens who, would say they're informed would say, well, yes, I follow MSNBC or I follow Fox News. I know, don't think that I'm not somehow a bad citizen. But what they know, of course, in many instances, is not factual, is not accurate. But they get reinforced in terms of their own views, which is okay, except these views push them toward the extremes. And so when you start looking at the environment here, it's really, to me, worrisome. And so what I worry about going forward, and I'll end on this point right now, is that if we go into let's say a society, an economy that really is going through some really rough times. Some people are projecting a recession, a deep recession. That creates greater concerns among the electorate, greater receptivity to perhaps simple solutions or whatever. And if in fact we have greater concerns about crime and the border and border insecurity and things like that, that adds to sort of the sense that the things are falling apart, the center cannot hold or whatever. And that will make, I think, Americans more susceptible to the kinds of appeals that we might think of as being, I'll put it gently, simply anti-democratic appeals. So I'm really quite worried. I think, again, what Kyle said is accurate, that we, and a lot of the deniers lost. Donald Trump's, I hate to say this, but Kyle, your book, of course, Ohio is not the battleground. Donald Trump's trophy in this election occurred right here in Ohio. Senator Vance, that was his trophy. Didn't get the trophy in Pennsylvania, didn't get the trophy in Georgia. And my one last shot or comment, and I hate to use a football analogy, but don't say I'm piling on here. Yes, Reverend Warnock won. Yes, Herschel Walker got 49% of the vote. I don't view that as necessarily a really happy sign that he got 49% of the vote.
You mentioned dark money, and that's actually next week's program too. So if you want to learn more about dark money next week, but expert on dark money here, Catherine Turcer. So let me ask you that same question though. Do you think that there's going to be anything that would kind of end some of this bipartisan strife?
So, I believe in the power and promise of democracy. I believe that we can find ways to come together. But I'm also super discouraged. And I think so were other people. So, one of the things I did kind of in preparation for this, because, you think, okay, where is democracy going? And I'm like, oh my Lord, where is it going? And you jump from one thing to another thing. And so, I did this survey where I asked people, hey, where did they think, things were going? And, it's not surprising, I watch how this is going, and non-scientific, but like one of the things that came out is there were a lot of people that expected a different kind of crazy. Right? Okay. All right. How many of you, right, expect, we don't exactly know where we'll be in 10 years, but we know the challenges that we have faced in the past 10 years. And I was thinking about, I'm a redistricting reformer, meaning I'm always thinking about, what's up for the next decade, what will happen for the next map making, how will this work? And, there have been a lot of times I've gotten my butt kicked. And it was solidly kicked in 2012 with Voters First, where we had an effort to change map making so that we would have an independent citizens commission. We take the map making out of the hands of elected officials with some good rules. It would be similar to what passed in Michigan and was in place for this map making. And so when I look back at 2013, that was really a regrouping year. And so I think we should in some ways think of this year also as a way to regroup, rethink about things. So if we look at last year, okay, I'm sorry, I needed therapy. And after all of the map making and what felt like this long constitutional crisis where our elected officials were not actually listening to the Ohio Supreme Court and doing the right thing by the voters. And the voters put that in place. And it filled me with incredible rage. Now, obviously therapy's good for everybody, but the guy that showed up to do it was a guy named Ira Glass. And he was the person who, I know, seriously, he asked me what I was thinking about redistricting, and I went through this long process. And when people think about This American Life, a lot of times, they're listening to the story and they're so into it. And yet, I guess the reason I'm thinking about this American Life and this story is this is a story that goes on and on and on. And what I know is I love my daughter. I love my family. You love your son. You love your family. We have so much in common. And we just need to figure out how it is we can talk about the things that we want. So, for example, I don't want to be ripped off, right? That's something that we can talk about improving in democracy. Why do we need to address dark money? So that our bills are reasonable when it comes time to utilities. When you start to think about all of the things that are wrong, there are fairly clear answers from the past, including better transparency. And with that, I appreciate this opportunity to talk to you all.
Kyle, you presented your optimistic viewpoint on what happened in 2022, but looking forward, even just the topic of this conversation, the future of democracy. you would think that would be something that people would be able to come together on, but it seems like we can't even decide on what the future of democracy is, especially since we know, for instance, it's clear there's no substantial voter fraud. The 2020 election wasn't stolen. The U.S. Capitol was attacked in an insurrection by supporters of former President Trump on January 6th. I mean, these are facts, but there are people who aren't accepting those.
Yeah, that's right. And the information environment is such, particularly I'd say with social media and whatnot, that conspiracy stuff just sort of runs amok. And also there's a lot of confirmation bias. There's this fancy term called negative partisanship, which is basically like you basically dislike your opponent even more than you like your own side. And I think particularly when that sort of thinking is strong, you're kind of likelier to believe the worst about your opponents, even if that's not necessarily true, but you sort of want it to be true, which is, I think, part of our sort of broader sort of societal problem. And they're also, to your point, there are always these sort of questions about like the process of voting, like how we should do it, how many days of early voting should there be, how much absentee voting should we have absentee voting? Generally speaking, I'd say that there's been, if you believe in greater access to the ballot and you don't just want election day to be a single day, there's been a lot of progress on that in many different states across the country, including this one. There was a bill that the governor signed recently that has a photo ID requirement and other things that I think some reformers, particularly on the left, probably don't like. And there's all sorts of implementation questions about those sorts of things. But there are these battles going on about access. I will say that generally speaking, the kind of trend across the country has been to greater and greater access to voting, which I think is a good thing. The pandemic was sort of part of that. And I think you had some states, kind of going to more of an absentee ballot model that is probably here to stay. In terms of the sort of trends over the next 10 years. So, we're in a period where we've had the longest consecutive streak in American history of at least close-ish presidential elections, meaning there has not been a double-digit margin in the popular vote since Reagan in '84, his reelection. And again, that's the longest stretch in American history where that hasn't been the case. There were some elections that were not particularly close, like Bush won in '88 or Clinton's 2 elections or Obama in 2008, but we're in a very close and competitive period here. And so one of the things I'm just thinking about is, is there something that will sort of snap us out of that? Will we have some sort of landslide election? What kind of candidate could produce something like that? Frankly, if you look at some of the most successful politicians in America, they're blue state Republicans, like Charlie Baker in Massachusetts, who's the former governor there, or Larry Hogan in Maryland, who was just term limited out in that state. That sort of politician might actually be very successful on the national level, but that person would have a very difficult time actually getting nominated. So that's something sort of thinking about. And then also, we talk about the presidential race. The House and the Senate, and even sort of lower down ballot races, they've become kind of increasingly correlated with the presidential results. So Gary Jacobson, who's a very distinguished congressional election scholar, he found that in the 2020 presidential election, both the House and the Senate results that year were more strongly correlated with the presidential results than in any previous election, or at least any election where they had good data to use. And so there's this growing trend toward this kind of lack of split ticket voting and the presidential race kind of defining everything. Is there something that snaps us out of that, or is that just sort of a trend that we're kind of continuing to sort of deal with? I did mention there was some, I think, important ticket splitting in the 2022 election, but that's much more kind of the exception as opposed to the rule. But that's sort of the period we're in. Very close and competitive elections. And also, the down ballot results very much related to the presidential results. The last time we had politics that were very consistently like this was like 100 years ago, or even in the late 1800s. And that was also around the time where you also kind of had the progressive era reforms and some of the things that changed back then, direct election of senators, women's suffrage comes out of that. Like, are we in sort of a similar kind of Gilded Age period? And then maybe there's some sort of, reforms that end up coming out of that. I don't know the answer to that, but that's something I'm very curious about in the coming years, including changes to, like I mentioned, election process. And there are some, things that I think people want to consider on that, be it redistricting reform, ranked choice voting, those sorts of things. And some of those ideas are kind of gaining in strength across the country, even though, particularly with ranked choice voting, there aren't a whole lot of places that actually have it.
ask you, following up on that, you've been active with actually talking to voters and getting petition signatures. You got a successful campaign in 2015 to stop gerrymandering at the Statehouse, and then in 2018 to stop gerrymandering at the congressional level in Ohio. Do you find that when you speak to people or your field people report back to you that the people they're talking to are more conservative? Are they more liberal? Are they further apart? Or are there moderates out there? I mean, a lot of people consider themselves moderates, but yet those are not the people that we typically hear from and see.
Well, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? So when we think about our politics and we think about kind of the loss of local journalism and the loss of some of the investigative work that we had in the past, that there are all sorts of people out there that are just thinking about getting home at the end of the day. They're concerned about their bills. They want to actually have some type of functional government. And they are out there. So the one thing that I would say is that if you ask people, if in fact the people who have to use those voting districts, that the politicians should draw districts for themselves, well, no one really agrees with that. I mean, this is the kind of thing, if we all decided we wanted to go to the local library with a clipboard, that is something, there's a deep understanding why it's problematic to let the folks in charge actually do the rules for themselves. And that's about redistricting that I'm talking about at the moment. But also, let's face it, the rules that are in place when it comes to money in politics are also created by the people that are, reined in by them, right? So like if we go back and we go even further back than 10 years, we think about the Citizens United versus FEC. And this is the decision that the US Supreme Court made that said, hey, corporations have First Amendment rights. Now that doesn't mean that corporations can give directly to candidates. This was a case that had to do with political advertisements. And, in 2010, when they talked about this, I don't know what I was imagining. I don't know, BP Oil running ads. And I was also imagining that we would have good transparency about this. I was imagining, because the US Supreme Court at the same time said, hey, you can spend money, corporations can spend money. Later, Free Speech Now said, hey, you can spend unlimited money on these ads. It's not money going directly to candidates, so there shouldn't be a quid pro quo. So naive, so naive. But what is important is that we have not taken advantage of transparency. Why is it that we can have ads where we don't actually know who they are, where we have all sorts of innocuous names? And you can think of, obviously there's Generation Now, that's an innocuous name, but you can start to think about Forward Justice. Like there are all of these different names that are so innocuous, and it's so hard to track the money because they're using these nonprofits, these C4 entities. And we're also talking money from truly wealthy individuals as well as corporations. And so if in fact we want to have a democracy that works better for all of us, and some folks will say a republic that works better for all of us, we should have in place the ability to follow the money. Not just so that we can root out corruption, but so that we understand, who's influencing the process, how close are they to our elected officials. It's incredibly important for us to understand what is happening in our elections. And right now, it's just like this cloud of dark money that is over all of us as we go into the voting booth.
You said Generation Now. I should point out that that is a group that pleaded guilty in the House Bill 6 federal corruption scandal trial for Larry Householder, the Republican former speaker, starts very shortly. So
you can see why it was easy to pick on them.
So, Dr. Asher, I want to ask you, with all of this frustration, with the concerns that Catherine and Kyle have both said, what about a third party? I think there are a lot of moderates who say, well, why can't there be a third party that goes against what these other two parties are doing? Would it have to be a billionaire, a celebrity? Do you think that there's even a place for a third party in American politics?
The rules of the game in the United States and in Ohio are designed to protect the two major parties. So any kind of third party candidacy would have to overcome a lot of biases And certainly in Ohio's laws, there really are a lot. An independent candidacy might be a little different, and especially an independent candidacy that was led by a charismatic person. Now, watch out what you wish for, because if things really get bad and you have an independent candidate who's charismatic, well, is he charismatic or she charismatic on the left, on the right, pro-democracy, anti-democracy? You want to watch out for that. And so I think what we're really dealing with right now is that the Republican Party has become, in a sense, the new party. And a lot of the battles are going on within the GOP. Now, perhaps at some point you could imagine the right wing of the party splitting off because Kevin McCarthy didn't keep his promises, or Donald Trump realizes that he will not win the Republican nomination. And so he says, come join my Freedom Party. Okay, now, Karen, I don't think that was what you were thinking of as somehow being a wonderful development. So, I mean, it's not likely, but certainly, there was a time when we thought, well, here's Governor Kasich, very skillful with the media, good record in Ohio, a moderate Republican, can reach across the aisle. Maybe he, in fact, could lead. And maybe he could pick a Democratic vice presidential candidate, and they could become the new party, if you will. Well, I think the odds are so against that right now. And the more likely thing is to have perhaps, people at either end of the political spectrum saying, oh, I'm not happy the Democrats aren't liberal enough, and have a group split off there, or on the Republican side, a group try to split off there. And that won't be necessarily good. Now, if I can just add one other thing, going back to redistricting, I just have to say this. You're only going back to 2015. I see someone in the audience here, Joan Lawrence, who in fact in 1980 had a constitutional amendment on the ballot, and it was defeated. And then I, with a lot of other people in 2005, had 4 constitutional amendments. And if you say that you lost badly, all I can say is we lost horrifically, or whatever. and so here is something where, when you talk about it, as Catherine said, most Ohioans would say, yes, of course legislators shouldn't draw their own districts. Of course votes should be meaningful. And so we finally did pass something, and then the redistricting commission, dominated by the GOP, basically ignored the Ohio Supreme Court. So when I hear people now say, let's go back to the ballot again and pass a stronger constitutional amendment, and I'm saying, well, wait a second. What guarantees are there that this next the Supreme Court, without Maureen O'Connor, will do any better? And I don't think there's any guarantees whatsoever, and the likelihood is just the opposite, which is depressing. And
go ahead.
No, and one last point. On polarization, even before, the dark times, if you will, and, Trump, but going back 10, 20 years ago, political scientists actually were learning that at the grassroots, at the mass level, at the citizen level, people's attitudes about the other party were becoming more polarized. So really predating a lot of these things, that they were, they had something called a thermometer scale, where pollsters would interview you and they would say, here are a list of political objects or people or whatever, and would you please rate them on a scale from 0 to 100, where 100 means warm and 0 means you're really cold, and 50 is neutral. And they've been doing this for decades. And in the past, it was possible for people to sort of say, I like Republicans, maybe because I am a Republican, but I like Republicans, and I don't like Democrats as much, but it wasn't that different. And over time, increasingly, the more you liked Republicans, the less you like Democrats, and vice versa. And so that was polarization at the grassroots. And in some ways, it predated a lot of the things that we've seen at the elite level and the institutional level. So it's sort of now embedded. And then it's reinforced by the media and by the behavior of our political elites.
I know Kyle wants to say something, but I want to ask Catherine, while we're on this topic, there's been talk about a constitutional amendment going back to the ballot to clarify what redistricting should look like. As Dr. Asher just said, in 2005, ballot issued to create an independent commission was defeated. Maureen O'Connor, the former Chief Justice, has said that she wants to work on this. What makes you think that the environment has changed that something like that would go through?
So before we go forward, let's go back. Because when you're talking about 2005, we're talking about the era of CoinGate. We're talking about this enormous scandal. And there seemed to be so much opportunity in 2005 for redistricting reform and thinking about campaign finance reform and making those kinds of changes. And so one of the things I think people do get in their heads is like, things should be, there should be this enormous scandal, or there should be this to move things along. And that can move things along, or sometimes it doesn't. And so, like, as we're thinking about, well, what should we do? Well, clearly, what we can't do is give up on voting. What we can't do is give up on participating in meaningful elections. What we can't do is actually give up on redistricting. And so that means these folks are drunk on power. They wouldn't even listen to the Ohio Supreme Court, which, let's face it, Matt Huffman was the sponsor of the legislation. He proposed having the Ohio Supreme Court be the court of record, and he was very clear that it didn't want to have the federal courts. So then when we finally get to the map making, to have them thumb their nose at what the Ohio Supreme Court was saying was egregious. And these folks are drunk on power. And what do you do with folks that are drunk on power? You take away the car keys. You take away the ability to create maps. And one of the things that we know is we've had enough kind of map making cycles that we know an independent citizen commission has worked for many years in Arizona. We know that it's worked in California. We watched our neighbors do it. We have information about the implementation. And that's why I believe, yes, if we just change the rules, yeah, who knows what the Ohio Supreme Court will do at this point. We have a new court. It's not clear what would happen. But what we do know is we need to take this map making out of the hands of elected officials. And that is a big change.
Before we go to questions here from the audience, Kyle, you had a couple things you wanted to add.
Just two points kind of piggybacking off what was said. First of all, one trend to watch, I think, is public corruption cases, because obviously there's a big one coming up here in Ohio. And I would say, personally, I think, unfortunately, it seems like the courts it's become harder and harder to convict public officials in these public corruption cases and to make it stick. I guess the one that I think of, just because I followed it closely, because at one time I was one of his constituents, was former Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell, who was convicted and basically getting gifts, and it ended up being overturned. And there have been others in recent years. And so the courts, even if you think that maybe there's a public official that you think you've got dead to rights on some sort of corruption problem, don't believe the conviction is going to happen until it actually happens, I think. The other point, just to go way back to about independent candidates, one trend we have seen in the states is that in states where you've got one party that's very clearly the majority party and the other party clearly the minority party, is that the minority party might essentially back an independent candidate instead of a candidate from their own party. And we saw this in the Utah Senate race last year, where Evan McMullin, former presidential candidate, third-party presidential candidate, who's kind of like a never-Trump Republican, which basically these days means is not a Republican at all, I think, or at least isn't viewed as a loyal Republican anymore by the Republican Party. McMullen ran as an independent against Republican Senator Mike Lee, and the Democratic Party decided not to nominate a candidate. And while McMullen lost, he did probably better than a Democrat would normally do in Utah. We saw this about a decade ago, too, in Kansas. The Democrats got behind a guy named Greg Orman, who ran as an independent. He ended up losing, but that was a more competitive race. Do we start to see those kinds of creative opportunities for, a party kind of stepping aside and backing an independent? Because the thing is that the political energy is generally kind of the way our system works is sort of funneled into just having two candidates, really. And so the one way the minority party could try to compete is to sort of cede the ground to the independent, although it also sets up an interesting question that if you elect an actual independent House member or senator, they then will go to Congress, and in order to basically get their committee assignments, they will have to then choose which side they want to caucus with, and that's a whole other thing that also I think discourages independent candidacies. But that's again, I do view that as sort of a creative kind of thing that's been happening lately, and I'm curious to see if it continues.
We're going to move to questions from our live stream and in-person audience here in just a few minutes. If you have a question, make your way to the microphone. Remember, questions end with a question mark. So be sure to formulate your question in the form of a question. If you're watching online, you can type your questions into the chat. And well, it looks like, Jane, you've already got the first question. Let's go.
We have several questions, and what we'll do, anyone who wants to ask a question, we'll do every other one. I'll do one online and so forth. So, Kyle, this is for you from Melissa Fisher. Is ranked choice voting a good solution to get more moderates and moderate points of view? What are the downsides other than the long odds of being implemented?
I think generally speaking, we can maybe sometimes overrate how much a process change will actually lead to sort of meaningful differences in who gets elected and how they govern. We do have California and Washington have a top two system in which everyone runs in a nonpartisan primary, and then the top two finishers advance. And there hasn't been a lot of great indication that has really reduced the kind of partisanship of California or Washington. But the other good thing about ranked choice voting, I think, or potential good thing about ranked choice voting is that it does, at the end of the process, require a candidate to demonstrate 50% majority support, even if that majority support is kind of cobbled together from first and second and third place votes. And that's probably a good thing, at least in terms of the public being sort of forced to provide some kind of majority to a candidate. I would say that ranked choice voting is sort of in vogue. You have seen it particularly kind of the municipal level in a lot of different places across the country. I don't believe that there's any place in Ohio that currently has ranked choice voting, but maybe that'll change in the future. And you also have had ranked choice voting emerge in Alaska and Maine, and it's led to some interesting results, particularly the election of Mary Peltola, a Democrat in Alaska, to the statewide House seat in a state that generally favors Republicans. Although there's some reason to believe that, given that Sarah Palin was her opponent, and Palin is pretty unpopular, that Peltola would have beaten Palin in a straight up race had there not been the ranked choice voting system. But it does potentially lead to more interesting outcomes. And, you could also see it as maybe potentially over the long term kind of fostering more of an ability for people to vote for independents, because they don't feel like they're throwing their vote away by voting independent. They could vote independent, and then they could also rank their choice so that when the race is actually decided, they're not left out of that process. So I think a lot of people kind of like it in theory. One thing I do kind of worry about is that we're at a time where people say a lot of irresponsible things about elections, about the process. They complain about the vote count taking too long. When the count is going on, that vacuum gets filled with conspiracy stuff. And the ranked choice voting process does take longer. It is a little bit more confusing, although I think if you provide good instructions, it's not that hard to figure out. But that I sort of worry about too.
Hi there. My name is Andrea Applegate. So when we're thinking about the future of democracy and thinking about 10 years from now, what do you think the impact or the outcome or the purpose of the January 6th committee and their conclusions will be?
Well, in a couple of weeks, the new majority in the U.S. House of Representatives will probably be doing an awful lot to discredit the January 6th committee. And it'll be more noise out there. But I think one wants to look at this more broadly. January 6th was focusing on a specific set of events, the violence, the insurrection that happened. But keep in mind, for 4 years, in fact, even before he was elected, Donald Trump, he won the election and he was still complaining about fraud back then. Why? Because he didn't get a majority of the popular. And throughout his presidency, he was talking about fraud and undermining the election system. And some of us who are suspicious say, why would you be doing that? And one answer might be, well, if you lose, you're setting the stage that in fact the whole election system is just illegitimate. And then we saw, prior to January 6th, a whole set of actions that didn't get sufficient coverage, but certainly in Georgia that they're following up, literally calling up the Secretary of State, find me 12,000 more votes. If that's not corrupt, what is? I mean, that's, and then all of these other things and these phony things that were happening in other states, the courts said no to all of them, but literally, and I just, on January 6th, after the insurrection, the House is voting on whether to accept the results of different states in terms of the Electoral College. And they finally reduced the number of challenges, but they finally insisted they're going to vote on Pennsylvania. And 147 Republicans in the US House and Senate voted to overturn the election. Okay, so the point is, it's not just January 6th, it's all the things that are leading up to that and all of the actions that were taken and the inability of more people who know better to call them out, because what they were trying to do was really overthrow the outcome of a legitimate election. They were trying to overthrow the government. What do we call that? Treason. Oh, can't believe you used that word. Oh, yeah. So we'll see what happens, but I'm afraid some of the lessons will get lost because there'll be new information out there from the new majority in the US House.
Another question? So this is kind of a combined question. Should Biden run in 2024? And then the corollary to that are, when are younger leaders going to emerge on the national stage? And will that change the trajectory to guide us to a better 2033?
I'll take the second part and then
we are starting to see some turnover in the leadership of the parties. Nancy Pelosi stepped aside as the House Democratic leader, and I always think about this. So the writer Andrew Sullivan, who's sort of a kind of conservative, he did this cover story for the Atlantic in I think 2007 or 2008 when Obama was running, and the headline was "Goodbye to All That." And basically presenting Obama as sort of the herald of sort of a post-baby boomer politics. Obama's technically a baby boomer, but he was born in 61, so sort of right at the end there. And now we don't have a baby boomer president. He's actually too old to be a baby boomer. He's from the silent generation. And we're still very much in this sort of like baby boomer kind of era in politics. And you ask the public in polling, like, should Biden run again? Generally speaking, people say no. Should Trump run again? Generally speaking, people say no. And yet, maybe that's the matchup we end up having. But it does seem like there's maybe an opportunity for both parties to maybe, if they're capable of doing it, if they want to do it, to offer something a little bit different in 2024. I mean, I mentioned how we're in this long period of fairly competitive presidential elections. Maybe if one of the two parties decided to offer something a little bit fresher and a little bit more different, maybe that's a way of getting us out of that. I'm not saying that necessarily would happen, but the country, I think, at least based on the polling data, would like some new leadership and to turn the page. But I don't know if we're actually going to produce that for 2024.
Comment quickly. On performance grounds, I don't think there's been a better speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives in my lifetime. And the fact that Nancy Pelosi is 82 is not a reason to say that she's out of touch. She probably is more in touch with the country and with the Democratic Party and the divisions within the Democratic Party. And Joe Biden's case, thank goodness at least he brings foreign policy experience in terms of dealing with Russia and Ukraine, and that does come with age and experience.
Hi, I'm Susan Miller. I'm a prolific letter to the editor writer. I've had several letters published, including one with my address last time around. Anyway, I'm not real comfortable being on stage, but I sure wish I was when the question was asked, is there a viable, moderate solution to the two-party system? I am also a state lead for the New Forward Party. So I'm here to tell you we're going to be something. We're well on our way. Well, with that said, I would like to ask, given that the Ohio Statehouse is making it more difficult for citizens to bring initiatives to the ballot, wondering if anybody up here might speak to the probability of being able to collect digital signatures.
Just a point of clarification, that has not been voted on yet. That has to pass by February 1st and then go before voters to be approved. And we don't know if it's going to go anywhere, but certainly it's out there.
And I think we are so far from digital signatures. Like, I just, it's funny because there was a period during 2020 where, I was like, there's nothing like I like better than getting my clipboard, getting my clipboard and getting everybody together. And there's a real beauty that we are a state that has direct democracy, that we have the ability to collect signatures, you get enough, and you actually can put it to the vote of the people. And so this is, something from the progressive era, but it has served us well. And it inspires us to think outside the box, right? Even if nothing ever, comes of a specific ballot measure, it has led the state legislature, for example, to take up redistricting reform. And yes, it's, it hasn't all turned out, roses, a bed of roses. But what's clear to me is that there have been times where that ability to collect signatures has been truly meaningful in advancing an agenda. And so, but I can't imagine we're anywhere near close to digital signatures. So what's interesting is I guess we'll see what will happen, but I can't imagine that for the next 10 years even.
Real quickly, what would a 60% threshold voter approval mean to groups like yours that would have to get 60% of voters to agree with what you've proposed?
So what we should be really clear about is, even though I love direct democracy, it is incredibly difficult. It is incredibly challenging to get 10% of the gubernatorial vote. It's incredibly complicated in terms of, you can't just get them in Columbus, Cleveland, and Cincinnati. You have to do them in 44 different counties. It has to be the address where they're registered to vote. There are things like a rainstorm that can ruin them. If you think about all of the different challenges where they weren't just exactly done technically correct, it's an incredible challenge. And then to go to vote and think that if you could get 59% of the vote and you would lose, it just would create a real obstacle for us to do a citizen initiative, knowing how hard it would be. And when you think about it, do we really want to end majority voting? Is that what we want? It makes no sense to me.
We have time for one more quick question and a quick answer. So go ahead.
I'm John Lowe. As you said, the attempt to overthrow the election is really an attempt to overthrow the government. And as a layman, it's just perplexing to me that in the 2 years since then, Donald Trump, who clearly led it, wasn't charged with insurrection. So my question is, why did that happen? Why hasn't it happened? And also, what do you think the chances are of him winning the Republican nomination and being elected president again?
I think the opportunity to hold Trump accountable was during the second impeachment, because the impeachment itself wasn't as important as the vote that would have happened if there had been a 2/3 conviction in the Senate. So if that had happened by a simple majority vote, the Senate could have barred Trump from running for office again, which I guess you could say is not necessarily criminal liability or something like that, but it would have removed the possibility of him winning in 2024 sometime in the future. And essentially Senate Republicans could not produce enough votes to be able to do that. And, I go back to the point I made earlier about how difficult it is. I mean, there's the stuff with January 6th, but then there's also a lot of public corruption stuff that has to do with Trump, both before he was in office and while he was in office, particularly dealing with some, the documents that they were found at Mar-a-Lago and whatnot. And, again, as strong as you think the case might be, I think actually getting a conviction, particularly conviction of a former president, it would be very difficult, again, no matter whether you or I or others thought it was warranted.
Well, I could do this all day. I'm sure you can as well, but we are out of time, so I'm going to turn it back over to Josh Harrison.
I hope you found today's forum interesting. Politics can be a difficult topic, but I think our panel did a great job keeping it nuanced and complex and yet interesting. And that's very on brand for CMC, so I want to thank them for living into that tradition. I also want to thank today's forum partners, WOSU Public Media, the League of Women Voters of Metropolitan Columbus, and to the Grange Insurance Audubon Center for their support. Thank you to our virtual seat patrons, to the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation, and the Columbus Dispatch for supporting today's live stream. And our very special appreciation to today's speakers, Kyle Kondik, Catherine Turcer, Herb Asher, and our host, Karen Kasler. Please make plans now to attend next Wednesday's forum here at the Grange Insurance Audubon Center. Our forum will be Shining a Light on Dark Money, very much related to what we talked about today, hosted by Joe Engels. Lastly, our thanks to each of you. We could not do this without you. Have a great afternoon, everyone.